So let's start with a bit of trivia. I'm going to give you a line from a movie, and I want you to name the film. I may be a woman, Sir William, but if I choose, I have the heart of a man. Anyone? Not Victoria. Someone got it. The film is Elizabeth, a film directed by my good friend, Shekhar Kapoor, who I met through our work in the film industry, starring Cate Blanchett, who I have absolutely never met, but I've worshipped since this 1998 film. Kate's performance in Elizabeth was a masterclass in possibility for me. The film tells a story of one of the world's most formidable rulers, Queen Elizabeth I, as she navigated a maze of political intrigue, all surrounded by a court of men questioning her every move. If you haven't seen it, some of you have, but if you haven't seen it, I'm not saying run home, put on a pair of pajamas, and order in some Chinese, and prepare for your world to be rocked, but I kind of am. You see, this film is not only a brilliant historical drama, but a testament to a powerful fact that much of England's golden age was architected by a woman. I came to this film in college, and for more nights than I want to admit, I watched and rewatched this film. Weekends and keg parties be damned. There I was. I was a history major specializing in foreign policy, eking it out in the cold tundra of upstate New York. In that climate, movies became my primary pastime, and Elizabeth was my everything. The gallantry, suspense, and of course her complexity, power, and influence, all combined to create this enthralling time's up before time's up masterpiece. I may be a woman, Sir William, but if I choose, I have the heart of a man. The lessons here are obvious. The image of a strong woman leader, rightly placed at the center of her own narrative. Elizabeth was a protagonist I could project my own ambitions upon. I dared myself to dream bigger. The next semester, I decided to run for the highest position a student on campus could run for, a seat on the Cornell University Board of Trustees. It was a grueling campaign, but I won. I love talking to my friends about the film that impacted them, the film that changed the way they see the world. And whether they are a doctor, lawyer, or engineer, they can always name at least one. And then I like to ask that doctor, lawyer, or engineer to take a moment and imagine that film never existing. I sometimes wonder if story, as seen through film, will outpace story read in books. We live in an increasingly visual world where images resonate more deeply and travel more quickly than words. Surely I had studied Elizabeth I in high school, but to see her portrayed on screen had a completely different effect on me. I'd say the same about watching actors like Florence Delay in Bresson's Joan of Arc or Daniel Day-Lewis in Spielberg's Lincoln. Again, I studied both. But to see their performances on screen felt transcendent. Every year, without fail, and with an almost relentless frequency, the West, and when I say the West, I'm primarily referring to Hollywood and large swaths of Western Europe, puts its historical narratives on screen. Narratives that further reify these figures and their lives in our consciousness. These figures become larger than life, so large, in fact, that they loom the world over. Since the dawn of cinema, We literally have thousands of depictions of life in antiquity, the British monarchy, the American Civil War, multiple tellings of Western triumphs across World War I and World War II. Through cinema, the West has established a hegemony. Western culture is the default lens through which we all see ourselves. Okay, so here's another quote. My daughter said she wanted to answer the call, and I was at home when I learned that she was shot. Anyone? So this was a trick. This line has never been uttered in any film. In fact, this line comes from the official record of a testimony given by the mother of Ariaha Okonya, a freedom fighter who died in the Women's War of 1929. The call Ariaha refers to is the call of Wanyerua, the woman who ignited the war. The Women's War of 1929 was one of the largest organized rebellions against British colonial presence on the continent. It was a war organized, led, and fought by women. 10,000 women marched from Owerri and Calabar provinces in the southeastern region of Nigeria, an area spanning 16,000 kilometers with a population of around 2 million people. They fought and died to assert power in the face of their disenfranchisement. This was Nigeria's Handmaid's Tale. In the almost 2 decades leading up to the Women's War of 1929, women of the region saw their businesses decimated as the British cut prices for their goods. Women were fined and jailed for gathering in public, for dancing, for being seen before or even after a certain hour. Women were assaulted, dragged into the bush, and raped. The British decreed to the Nigerian woman, "You are to be unseen and unheard." Now, I am a Nigerian woman, an Igbo woman from Anambra State. I know there are Nigerians in this audience, and so something tells me, and maybe it's from watching my grandmother, my mother, my aunts and great aunts, that our wiring in the early 1900s probably matched our present day disposition. And that's because even then, the Nigerian woman was a vocal, visible, and public actor. A concept that clashed with British ideals of patriarchy and proper Victorian norms. In pre-colonial times, Nigerian women of the southeastern region shared power with men and governed over areas of society. They held titles and ruled over their own councils. They adjudicated in courts. They lorded over the economic health of their communities. There was gallantry and grace in their dance and traditions. They didn't wear suffocating corsets and heavy balloon skirts. Their bodies were loosely covered, their heads elegantly crowned and waists adorned. Their movement was unrestricted. So when an officer on colonial duty entered Wanyerua's compound to count her in order to collect tax, she was having none of it. How do you collect tax on nothing when you have already stripped everything? As the officer stood before her, a man young enough to be her son, speaking to her as if she was his child, he became the embodiment of years of oppression, the dissolution of her culture, of her Nigeria. She resisted. The man lunged forward and grabbed her by the throat and choked her. a wave of volcanic fury came over Nwanyirua, and she choked him back. The officer was shocked by the strength of the woman, and he fled her compound. Nwanyirua, breathing heavily, soon collected herself and ran to alert the other woman. "It has happened, oh!" The news spread like wildfire. Using the palm frond as their signal, the women readied for war. The greatest and bloodiest battle of the war occurred almost 90 years ago to this day. The fighters valiantly marched forward, armed only with pistols used daily to pound yam. The British were not prepared to deal with a group of women taking such planned strategic action. And so overwhelmed as they were, they raised their rifles and shot at them, chasing women into the river as they plunged to their death. The British killed hundreds of women that day. As tragic as this was, the war had positive outcomes. Although they did not leave, the British conceded to many of the demands of the women, and by 1933, there were areas of increased self-governance. And still, by staging such a major rebellion against the British presence in Africa, these women who fought and died for their nation demonstrated to an entire continent that independence was possible. Now you tell me, why is that not a story told with relentless frequency on screen? I will forever cherish the film Elizabeth, and yet to learn years later that I had my own heroines in my own likeness, floored me. While it's lovely to imagine myself here in England, how much lovelier to imagine myself in the country of my own birth, with these women, where there was an actual square peg fits square hole space for me in the narrative. If multiple portrayals of such an image existed, I wonder how Nigeria would be different. How would Africa be different? Would we recognize that patriarchy should be counted as one of these diseases introduced by our colonizer, and finally free men from the confines of toxic masculinity and restore women's place to society? Would we understand that we have always been feminist until an outsider told us we were wrong? When I look at present-day Nigeria, a country brimming with so much potential but burdened with so much strife, could the relentless retelling of this story awaken something in our people that we stand up selflessly and not selfishly and shout, "Enough"? How would the world be different? Surely if I can see myself in Elizabeth, many more can see themselves in these women. What if women fighting for equality in the Americas, the UK, and across Europe could look to these role models in Nigeria who led societies as they now aspire to? Now, I'm not saying that films alone can change the world, but I'm of the school of thought that great cinema begins as conversation with its audience, and each audience member decides his or her own response, whether to shrug, to think differently, or to act. It pains me to say it, but we are still a colonized people. The woman who fought the Women's War of 1929 fought to preserve our culture, our way of life, our identity as a people. The lack of investment in our storytellers is a failure of that legacy. What worries me most is not the oil and the minerals being extracted daily from the continent of Africa, but the further extraction of our self-worth and the denial of self-actualization by not seeing our stories on screen. We live in a distorted reality where the vast majority of the films we watch come from the West. The rest of us are not an underrepresented minorities, but an underrepresented majority. Streaming platforms are making content more available than ever before. With distribution increasingly democratized, films and series now barrel into the palm of our hand at an unprecedented pace. Should we continue to choose to sit this out, then we are allowing a more pernicious form of colonization to continue to not only exist in practice, but to grow in power, the colonization of culture. I recently left my position as a director of international films for Netflix, a position I held for about 6 years. While there, I crisscrossed the globe, building up a business specifically dedicated to elevating storytelling that did not come from Hollywood, but from film ecosystems across the world, especially Africa. It's a legacy I'm very proud of. This side of the business grew because with each film I greenlit into production or acquired, I saw that audience demand for a good story was increasingly agnostic as to what country the story originated. I can say with authority, the demand for our stories is there. It's just up to us to work on bettering the quality of the supply. I mentioned my doctor, lawyer, and engineer friends earlier, and this was highly intentional. Many Africans here will relate to the experience of growing up and understanding that these are the oft-celebrated professions. Art is often seen in the realm of leisure. I myself am the daughter of a doctor and engineer. But before their present careers, my mother was an actress and my father was a musician. This outlook of what constitutes serious enterprise extends outside of the home and into the public sphere, where we have governments and captains of industry that barely support cinema, let alone the arts. Our terribly low theater per capita ratio is just one indicator of this. But filmmaking is serious enterprise. It's been the primary marketing engine of the West for over a century. Gene Kelly tap danced into rooms long before Jeff Bezos walked into them. It's baffling that we refuse to see the power of this medium while we curiously remain beholden to it and even afraid of it. There are governments on our continent that censor films and imprison filmmakers, all while using this art form and weaponizing it for their own ends. The relegation of our creative economy presents a real danger to our future as a continent. A friend of mine was in Havana, and emblazoned on the walls of a film school there is the phrase, "Un país sin imagen que no existe." This translates to a country without the moving image is a country that does not exist. I am now a filmmaker and will walk this talk because I want to see our history on screen. It is a huge task and a lot of ground to cover, and myself and the army of filmmakers on the continent and across the diaspora cannot do it alone. But let me be clear, this is not a call to the West, but a call to us as a people. A call for us to finally shake the last vestiges of colonization and own our narrative. Our vault of stories is massive, full of queens, kings, warriors, vast gilded kingdoms, not to mention our oral histories and libraries of work from our own authors waiting to be shown on screen. Our films are our truth. And I don't believe that one country's stories is more important than the other one. I believe it's the making of the story that gives it importance. Thank you.